She walked through fire to reach him. What happened next changed history. Spring 1945. Europe lay shattered beneath the weight of 6 years of total war. The Third Reich, once a seemingly invincible empire stretching from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow, now crumbled under the relentless advance of Allied armies. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to skeletal ruins. Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, Cologne. Names that once evoked culture and prosperity now meant only devastation. Millions of German civilians found themselves trapped in a nightmare, not of their making, caught between the collapsing Nazi regime and the advancing forces of liberation. By April 1945, the situation had become desperate beyond measure. The Wehrmacht, Hitler's once mighty military machine, was in full retreat on all fronts. Soviet forces pushed from the east with overwhelming fury, exacting terrible revenge for the horrors inflicted upon their homeland. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces swept across the Rhine, penetrating deep into the German heartland. Between these converging armies, civilian populations faced impossible choices: stay and risk the chaos of battle, or flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs into an uncertain future. The roads became rivers of human misery. Refugees by the millions trudged westward, hoping the Western Allies would prove more merciful than the advancing Soviets. Families were torn apart in the confusion. Children became separated from parents in the crush of desperate crowds. The elderly and infirm fell by the wayside, unable to keep pace. Communication networks had collapsed entirely. There was no way to send word, no way to find lost loved ones, no way to know if anyone you cared about still lived. In this landscape of total breakdown, women and children suffered most acutely. With so many German men dead or captured, mothers struggled alone to protect their families. Food was scarce. Medical care was non-existent. Shelter meant whatever ruins still had a roof. Every day brought new dangers. Unexploded ordnance littered the countryside. Desperate soldiers from scattered units roamed without command. Disease spread through crowded refugee camps. And always, the sound of artillery grew closer. The Allied forces advancing through this devastation faced their own moral complexities. These were the soldiers who had fought through Normandy, across France, through the brutal winter of the Ardennes. They had seen their friends die. They had liberated concentration camps and witnessed horrors that would haunt them forever. Now they occupied the homeland of the enemy who had inflicted such suffering upon the world. The temptation toward vengeance was real. Yet most Allied soldiers, particularly the Americans, tried to maintain discipline and treat civilians according to the rules of war. At the top of the Allied command structure stood General Dwight David Eisenhower. As Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, he bore responsibility for coordinating the largest military operation in human history. Millions of troops from multiple nations answered ultimately to him. Every strategic decision, every major offensive, every policy regarding occupied territories crossed his desk. The weight of this responsibility was crushing. Every choice meant lives saved or lost, not in dozens but in thousands. Eisenhower was 54 years old that spring, a career military officer from Kansas who had risen through the ranks not through battlefield heroics, but through organizational brilliance and an uncanny ability to manage the egos and agendas of Allied leaders. He coordinated between Churchill and Roosevelt, between Montgomery and Patton, between competing national interests and military strategies. He was a political general, yes, but also a deeply humane one. In recent weeks, Eisenhower had witnessed something that shook him to his core. As Allied forces liberated territory, they discovered the concentration camps: Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Dachau. The systematic murder factories of the Holocaust revealed themselves in all their horror. Eisenhower personally visited these sites. He walked through the barracks where skeletal survivors barely clung to life. He saw the piles of corpses, the gas chambers, the crematoria. He ordered extensive documentation, knowing that future generations might not believe such evil had existed. He forced German civilians from nearby towns to tour the camps, to see what had been done in their name. These experiences reinforced Eisenhower's conviction that the Allied cause was just, but they also deepened his understanding of war's human cost. He issued clear directives to his commanders regarding the treatment of German civilians. Allied forces were to distinguish between Nazi criminals and ordinary people. Non-combatants were to be treated humanely. International humanitarian principles were to be respected. Food and medical care were to be provided where possible. The occupation was to be firm, but not vengeful. Yet Eisenhower knew that orders from headquarters meant little in the chaos of the front lines. Individual soldiers and local commanders made countless decisions every day that affected civilian lives. The Supreme Commander could set policy, but he could not personally oversee every interaction between his troops and the German population. He had to trust that his directives would filter down through the ranks, that the values he articulated would be reflected in the actions of men exhausted by years of combat. In a small village near the German-Allied border, a village whose name has been lost to history, lived a 7-year-old girl named Greta. Before the war, her life had been ordinary in the way that childhood should be. She played with friends, helped her mother with household tasks, listened to her father's stories in the evening. The family was not wealthy, but they had enough. Her father worked as a tradesman. Her mother kept a small garden. Life was simple and secure. Then came the war. Greta's father was conscripted into the Wehrmacht. Like millions of German men, he had little choice in the matter. Refusal meant imprisonment or execution, and reprisals against his family. He kissed his wife and daughter goodbye and marched away to fight in a war he may not have believed in, for a regime he may not have supported. Greta remembered that day. She remembered her mother's tears, her father's forced smile, the way he held her tight before letting go. For years, Greta and her mother Ilse waited. Letters came sporadically, heavily censored, revealing little. They endured the rationing, the air raids, the growing sense that Germany was losing. Ilse did her best to shield her daughter from the worst of it, but there was only so much a mother could do. The bombs fell regardless. The food grew scarcer regardless. The news from the fronts grew worse regardless. In the final weeks of the war, Greta's father returned, but he returned only to die. Wounded in the chaotic retreat, he made it home just long enough for his family to see him one last time. Greta watched her father, the man who had seemed so strong and invincible, waste away in their small home. There was no medicine, no doctor who could help. He died in his own bed, with his wife holding his hand and his daughter crying at his side. They buried him in the village cemetery, one more grave among thousands of new ones. Days later, the war came to their village directly. Artillery fire announced the approach of American forces. The remaining German troops, a ragtag collection of old men and boys, put up token resistance before melting away. In the confusion, a shell struck near the shelter where Greta and Ilse had taken refuge. The blast threw Ilse against a wall. She crumpled to the ground, blood spreading across her dress from wounds Greta could not fully see. Ilse knew she was badly hurt. She could feel internal injuries, the kind that needed immediate medical attention, or they would prove fatal. But medical attention was nowhere to be found. The village had no functioning hospital. The German military medical corps had retreated. The American forces were still fighting their way forward. Ilse realized with terrible clarity that she would likely die here in this ruined shelter, leaving her daughter alone in the world. But Ilse was not ready to give up. With trembling hands, she found a scrap of paper and a pencil. She wrote a letter, switching between German and broken English, using every word she could remember from her school days decades ago. The letter was simple and desperate. It explained that she was wounded and needed help. It begged whoever found it to save her life. It was addressed to no one in particular, because Ilse had no idea who might read it. Then Ilse did something extraordinary. She told her 7-year-old daughter to take the letter and find the American soldiers. She told Greta to walk until she found them, to give them the letter, to ask them for help. She told her daughter to be brave, to not give up, to do whatever it took to bring help back. Greta, terrified and crying, promised she would. She took the letter, kissed her mother's pale face, and walked out into the devastated landscape alone. The journey Greta undertook would have been daunting for an adult. For a 7-year-old child, it was almost unimaginable. She walked through streets lined with rubble. She passed bodies that had not yet been collected. She heard gunfire in the distance and had no idea if she was walking toward safety or danger. Other refugees passed her, too absorbed in their own survival to pay attention to one more lost child. Greta kept walking. She had no map, no clear sense of direction. She simply followed the road westward, toward where she had heard the Americans were coming from. Her small legs carried her kilometer after kilometer. She was hungry, thirsty, exhausted. Fear threatened to overwhelm her with every step. But she had made a promise to her mother, and that promise kept her moving forward. Finally, after what felt like forever, Greta saw them. American soldiers, their uniforms different from the German ones she had known, their vehicles marked with white stars. They were setting up a temporary position in what had once been a town square. Greta approached slowly, uncertain of what reception she would receive. She had been taught that the Americans were the enemy, but her mother had told her to trust them. She had no other choice. The soldiers noticed the small girl approaching. They saw her torn dress, her dirty face, the exhaustion in her eyes. One of them, a corporal named James Mitchell, walked over to her. He knelt down to her level and spoke gently, though Greta understood little English. She held out the letter with shaking hands. Mitchell took it, unfolded it, and began to read. Mitchell's face changed as he read. Here was a woman, wounded and dying, and her daughter had walked through a war zone to ask for help. It was the kind of story that could break your heart or harden it, depending on what kind of man you were. Mitchell looked at Greta, at this small child who had shown more courage than many soldiers, and made a decision. He would pass the letter up the chain of command. But Mitchell knew the reality. There were thousands of similar cases, wounded civilians everywhere. Resources were limited. The military's priority was completing the conquest of Germany and preparing for the occupation. One wounded German woman was not a strategic priority. The letter would probably be filed away, a sad story among thousands of sad stories. Mitchell expected nothing to come of it, but he would try anyway. Greta refused to leave. She sat down near the American position and waited. The soldiers tried to give her food, water, a blanket. She accepted these gratefully, but would not move. She had promised to bring help, and she would wait until help came. Days passed. Greta slept on the ground near the American vehicles. The soldiers grew accustomed to her presence, this small, silent witness to their occupation. Meanwhile, the letter began its unlikely journey up the military hierarchy. Mitchell gave it to his lieutenant, explaining the situation. The lieutenant, moved despite himself, passed it to the captain. The captain sent it to the major. At each level, officers expected it to be dismissed. There were protocols for dealing with civilian casualties. Those protocols involved local authorities, not the chain of command. But something about this case kept it moving upward. Perhaps it was the image of the child walking alone through the war zone. Perhaps it was the desperation evident in the mother's broken English. Perhaps it was simply that each officer who read it felt compelled to let someone higher up make the decision to ignore it. Whatever the reason, the letter kept rising through the ranks, major to colonel, colonel to general. Each time the expectation was that this would be where it stopped, but it did not stop. Through a combination of chance, compassion, and the sheer unlikeliness of the situation, the letter reached the headquarters of the Supreme Allied Commander. It landed on a desk in the office complex where Eisenhower and his staff coordinated the final operations of the European war. An aide sorting through the endless paperwork that war generates came across it. He read it, paused, and made a decision that would change everything. He brought it to Eisenhower's attention. Eisenhower read the letter that evening. He had spent the day dealing with matters of grand strategy, coordinating with Soviet forces for the final push on Berlin, planning for the occupation zones that would divide Germany, addressing reports of Nazi officials attempting to flee to South America. His mind operated at the level of armies and nations, but when he read Ilsa's letter, when he learned that a 7-year-old girl had been waiting for days for a response, something shifted. Eisenhower's aides briefed him on the situation. They explained that the girl was still at the forward position, refusing to leave. They noted that the mother was likely already dead by now, given the time that had passed and the severity of her wounds as described. They gently suggested that this was a matter for local military government authorities, not for the Supreme Commander's attention. There were proper channels for these things. Eisenhower listened to all of this. Then he asked a simple question. Where exactly was the woman? His staff scrambled to find the location based on the information in the letter and the reports from the unit that had taken in Greta. They provided coordinates. Eisenhower studied the map, then issued an order that shocked everyone in the room. He ordered that a unit be dispatched immediately to locate and rescue Ilse. He specified that she was to receive full medical attention as a priority case. He made clear that this was a direct order from his office to be executed without delay. He authorized the use of whatever resources were necessary, and he ordered that the girl be informed that help was coming. The room fell silent. Senior officers exchanged glances. This was unprecedented. The Supreme Commander was personally intervening to save one German civilian woman. In the midst of concluding the largest war in history, with 1 million urgent matters demanding attention, Eisenhower was sending soldiers on a rescue mission for a single person. It made no strategic sense. It violated standard procedures. It would set a precedent that could lead to thousands of similar requests. One of Eisenhower's senior staff officers voiced these concerns. Respectfully but firmly, he pointed out the problems with this decision. How could they justify using military resources for one civilian when so many others needed help? How would they respond to the inevitable flood of similar requests? What about the chain of command and proper procedures? Eisenhower listened, then responded with words that would be remembered by everyone present. He said that if the Allied forces could not respond to the plea of a child, if they could not show mercy to the helpless, then what exactly were they fighting for? He said that they had just liberated the concentration camps, had seen the ultimate result of a system that treated human beings as disposable. He said that the new peace they were building had to be different, had to be better, had to recognize the value of every individual life. He acknowledged that they could not save everyone. He knew that thousands would die whom they could not help. But this one woman, brought to his attention by the courage of her daughter, this one life he could save. And he would. The order stood. Within hours, a rescue team was assembled. They consisted of medics, soldiers, and a translator. They were given the coordinates and Greta's description of how to find the shelter, and Greta herself insisted on going with them. She would show them the way. The soldiers tried to dissuade her, but she was adamant. This was her mother. She would lead them. The team set out at dawn. Greta rode in the lead vehicle, directing them through the ruined landscape. She remembered the way despite her exhaustion and fear during the original journey. She pointed out landmarks that meant nothing to the soldiers but everything to her. A burned tree, a collapsed house with a red door, a church steeple that still stood despite everything around it being destroyed. The journey was not without danger. Pockets of German resistance still existed. Unexploded ordnance littered the roads. The team had to proceed carefully, balancing speed with caution. Greta sat in the vehicle, silent and tense, willing them to go faster. Every minute that passed was a minute her mother might be dying. Finally, they reached the village. Greta jumped from the vehicle before it fully stopped and ran toward the shelter. The soldiers followed, medical equipment ready. They entered the dark, damaged structure, flashlights cutting through the gloom. And there, in the corner where Greta had left her, was Ilse. She was alive, barely. She had survived on rainwater that had leaked through the damaged roof in sheer force of will. Her wounds were infected. She was feverish and delirious, but she was breathing. When she heard Greta's voice, her eyes opened. She saw her daughter, saw the American soldiers, and understood that somehow, impossibly, help had come. The medics went to work immediately. They assessed her injuries, started an IV, administered morphine for the pain, and prepared her for transport. They worked with the efficiency of men who had treated countless battlefield casualties. but also with a gentleness born of knowing that this mission came from the very top of the command structure. This was not just another casualty. This was someone the Supreme Commander himself had ordered them to save. They loaded Ilse onto a stretcher and carried her to the vehicle. Greta held her mother's hand the entire time, tears streaming down her face, speaking to her in rapid German that the soldiers could not understand, but whose meaning was clear. "You are safe now. I brought help. You are going to live." The team transported Ilse to a field hospital that had been set up in a requisitioned German school building. There, doctors performed surgery to repair her internal injuries. They treated her infections with the new miracle drug, penicillin, that had saved so many Allied soldiers. They gave her blood transfusions, fluids, and round-the-clock care. Greta never left her side. Over the following days, Ilse slowly recovered. The fever broke, the infections cleared, her strength began to return. She learned the full story of what had happened, how her daughter had walked through the war to find help, how the letter had made its way to Eisenhower himself, how the Supreme Commander had personally ordered her rescue. She could not believe it. In the midst of this vast war, with millions of lives at stake, the man commanding all Allied forces in Europe had stopped to save her. The story began to spread through the Allied ranks. Soldiers talked about it in their camps and barracks. The girl who walked through the war, the general who sent an army to save one woman. In a conflict defined by mass death and industrial-scale destruction, here was a story of individual compassion and the value of a single life. It resonated deeply with men who had seen too much death, who wondered if anything good could come from all this suffering. For many soldiers, the story renewed their sense of purpose. They had not been fighting just to defeat an enemy, but to defend a set of values. Values that said every life mattered. Values that said the strong had a duty to protect the weak. Values that said mercy and compassion were not weaknesses, but the very things that separated civilization from barbarism. Eisenhower's decision embodied those values in a way that no speech or directive could match. The story also affected how Allied soldiers treated German civilians in the weeks that followed. Knowing that their Supreme Commander had personally intervened to save a German woman made it clear that the occupation was not to be one of vengeance. The message filtered down through the ranks. We are here to build a just peace, not to perpetuate the cycle of hatred and violence. Individual acts of kindness and mercy increased. The occupation, while firm, was more humane than it might otherwise have been. Eisenhower himself never sought publicity for what he had done. There was no press release, no photo opportunity, no attempt to use the story for propaganda purposes. He had acted out of genuine conviction, not for public relations benefit. When asked about it later by his staff, he simply said that it had been the right thing to do. He saw no need to elaborate further. Greta and Ilse survived the war. As Germany began the long process of recovery and reconstruction, they rebuilt their lives. The trauma of what they had endured would never fully leave them, but they had each other. Ilse would tell her daughter as she grew older that she owed her life to Greta's courage and to the compassion of a man she never met. Greta would remember always that even in the darkest times, when everything seemed lost, hope and humanity could still prevail. Years later, after the war, some historians and journalists attempted to verify and document the story. The details were difficult to confirm. Military records from that chaotic period were incomplete. Many of the soldiers involved had moved on with their lives, scattered across America and beyond. Eisenhower himself, who went on to serve as NATO's first Supreme Commander and then as President of the United States, rarely spoke of the incident. When pressed, he would acknowledge that such things had happened, that there had been many cases where Allied forces had helped German civilians, but he deflected attention from his personal role. What is documented is Eisenhower's character and his policies regarding the treatment of civilians. His orders to his commanders were clear and consistent. Distinguish between Nazi criminals and ordinary Germans. Treat non-combatants humanely. Provide aid where possible. These were not just words. Eisenhower enforced these policies and held commanders accountable for violations. The occupation of Germany under his oversight was remarkably restrained compared to what it might have been, given the horrors that had been discovered in the concentration camps. Eisenhower understood something that many military leaders throughout history have failed to grasp. How you treat the defeated enemy shapes the peace that follows. An occupation based on vengeance and cruelty breeds resentment and plants the seeds of future conflict. An occupation based on justice and mercy, while firm in punishing genuine war criminals, creates the possibility of reconciliation and lasting peace. Germany's transformation from Nazi dictatorship to stable democracy was built on this foundation. The story of Greta and Ilse, whether in its specific details or as representative of Eisenhower's broader approach, illustrates a profound truth about leadership. True power is not just the ability to command armies and destroy enemies. True power is the wisdom to know when to show mercy, the courage to act on that wisdom even when it is inconvenient or unpopular, and the moral clarity to see the humanity in every person, even those who were recently your enemies. In the spring of 1945, Europe was a charnel house. Millions had died. Cities lay in ruins. Hatred and trauma scarred an entire continent. It would have been easy, even understandable, for Allied leaders to view German civilians with indifference or contempt. They were, after all, the people who had supported, or at least tolerated, the Nazi regime. They had cheered Hitler's victories. They had benefited from the plunder of conquered nations. Why should they deserve mercy now? But Eisenhower and many others in the Allied leadership rejected this logic. They understood that the German people were not monolithic. Many had been victims of the Nazi regime themselves. Many had been coerced or deceived. And even those who had supported the Nazis were still human beings, capable of change, deserving of basic dignity. The children especially, like Greta, bore no responsibility for the war and deserved a chance at a better future. This understanding shaped the post-war order. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe, included Germany. The Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted Nazi war criminals, also established important principles about individual responsibility and the rule of law. The occupation, while it had its problems and injustices, ultimately gave way to German self-government and integration into the Western democratic community. None of this was inevitable. It required conscious choices by leaders like Eisenhower to pursue reconciliation rather than revenge. The story of one general's decision to save one woman and her daughter is, in this context, more than just a heartwarming anecdote. It is a symbol of the values that shaped the post-war world. It demonstrates that even in the midst of total war, even when dealing with a defeated enemy, it is possible to maintain one's humanity and act with compassion. It shows that leadership is not just about winning battles, but about building a better peace. For Greta, the lesson was different, but equally profound. She learned that courage matters, that persistence matters, that one person's actions can make a difference even when the odds seem impossible. She was 7 years old and alone in a war zone, but she did not give up. She kept walking until she found help. She refused to leave until that help was sent. Her determination saved her mother's life and created a story that would inspire others for generations. In our own time, when the world faces different but no less serious challenges, the story of Greta and Eisenhower remains relevant. It reminds us that compassion is not weakness. It reminds us that leaders are defined not just by their grand strategies but by their treatment of the vulnerable. It reminds us that every individual life has value, that no one is just a statistic or a casualty figure, that behind every number is a person with hopes and fears, and people who love them. The spring of 1945 was one of the darkest periods in human history, but it was also a time when the better angels of human nature asserted themselves, when soldiers showed mercy to former enemies, when leaders chose justice over vengeance, when a 7-year-old girl's courage and a general's compassion combined to save a life and affirm the value of human dignity. Eisenhower went on to lead NATO and served 2 terms as President of the United States. He oversaw the beginning of the Cold War, the integration of American schools, the construction of the interstate highway system, and countless other momentous events. But perhaps his greatest legacy was not any single policy or achievement, but the example he set of leadership grounded in moral principle. He understood that power without compassion is tyranny, and that true strength includes the ability to show mercy. The letter that Ilse wrote with trembling hands, that Greta carried through a war zone, that made its way up the chain of command to the desk of the Supreme Allied Commander, was just a piece of paper, but it represented something much larger. It represented the hope that even in the worst of times, humanity can prevail. It represented the belief that those with power have a responsibility to use it justly. It represented the simple truth that every life matters. In the end, that is what shocked everyone about Eisenhower's decision. Not that he had the power to order a rescue mission. Everyone knew he had that power. What shocked them was that he chose to use that power for one ordinary person, one wounded woman, who had no strategic importance, no political value, nothing to offer except her humanity. In a war where millions died as mere numbers, Eisenhower insisted that this one person mattered. And in doing so, he reminded everyone that they all mattered. The story of the 7-year-old German girl who asked Eisenhower to save her mother, and what he did next, is ultimately a story about the kind of world we want to build. Do we want a world where might makes right? Where the powerful do as they please and the weak suffer what they must? Or do we want a world where power is tempered by mercy, where strength is used to protect the vulnerable, where every person is recognized as having inherent dignity and worth? Eisenhower chose the latter. In the midst of total war, with 1,000 urgent matters demanding his attention, he stopped to save one life. He did not have to. No one would have blamed him for letting the letter be handled through normal channels, for prioritizing strategic concerns over one individual case. But he understood that how we treat the least powerful among us defines who we are. He understood that the values we claim to fight for mean nothing if we abandon them when they become inconvenient. That is the lesson of this story. That is why it matters. Not because it changed the course of the war or altered history in some grand way, but because it showed that even in the darkest times, even when everything seems lost, compassion and courage can still make a difference. One child's determination, one mother's hope, one leader's choice. Together, they created a moment of light in the darkness, a reminder that humanity can survive even the worst that we inflict upon ourselves. Greta walked through fire to reach him, and what Eisenhower did next was simple, profound, and shocking in its basic decency. He sent help. He saved a life. He proved that in the end, despite everything, we can still choose to be better than our worst impulses. We can still choose mercy over vengeance, compassion over indifference, hope over despair. That choice, made over and over again by individuals at every level of society, is what builds a better world. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible historical tales that deserve to be remembered. Hit that like button if you believe compassion can change the world, and leave a comment below telling us what you think about Eisenhower's decision. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. Thank you for watching.